And we're live, and I'm scratching my ear. Of course I am. Okay. This is Oneness Talking Point, episode 25. And I am looking around because I'm still not sure if this is working through the microphone, which is fine. Perfect, even considering this episode is called Perfection, which has a lot of indications in our lives, in the stories that we tell about what it is. As I said in the description, there is a sense of no one and nothing being perfect. And we say it quite offhandedly in defense of not getting things right or being the unique person that we are. When really, in the scheme of things, in the universe of all that is that's already in harmony, the unique person that we are is the perfection of oneness, is the perfection of this moment. And all those stories about self, separation. I mean, even I think for me lately, there's a topic of conversation about the difference between soul and grace. Like there's soulful entrepreneurs, but for me, I would rather say graceful, as in full of grace or of grace. The concept of soul feels small and separate and segregated and layered and attached in time to some linear story. And I'm just looking because that's the rubbish people. And we haven't put our bin out yet. And I hope that you can't hear all of that noise. But if you can, that's perfect. And I wonder how often that happens for you. That ability to have a story about what is and accept that as perfect. Not perfect, all the ducks in a row, all the loose ends tied up, all the imperfections removed, all the, I don't know, relationships happy. I don't think that's what perfection is about for me, and I don't think that's what it's about in the oneness experience. The notion of perfection, like oneness, already exists. There's a story, a version of the story where perfection is what is, rather than, looking at what we call the world and saying, what's perfect about it? How can we tell our version of what's going on and justify it as perfect? I think that's that's perfection, the goal, the same as oneness, the goal. That's a sense of the things that we haven't achieved yet. Whereas the assumption and faith and trust that oneness is what is, that perfection is what is, that oneness is already perfect, that it already has its own sense of harmony, that the balance that inherently exists is not necessarily visible on social human scale, is and is invisible for a reason, is invisible as part of that perfection, not as a sense of a veil that has to be lifted in order for something better to exist. There is no better in that sense of perfection that's inherent. There is no illusion, except for the fact that illusion and the veil exist as some of the stories that we tell, which are included in the perfection of oneness and all that is. And I think that's a tricky point to get around in conversation. That there is and is not. There, that it's included and yet it is not. So it can't be necessarily defined in one way, and yet it can be, and that's part of what's included. There's no rejection, and if there is a rejection, then that's included. It's not a concept that makes sense in zero-sum reality. It's not a concept that makes sense in an either-or version of the story. It's not a concept that makes sense in a good and bad, religious, spiritual, logical, scientific version of this is what it is, and it can be defined in such a way and argued against in another. It makes sense in the seesaw cosmology. It makes sense in the unprincipled nowness of all that is. And if it doesn't make sense to you, then it doesn't make sense to you. I don't think there's any need for it to make sense to you in that way. I think the important thing is, how does it make sense to you? And so when I'm talking about perfection in the way that it makes sense in the oneness experience, what's coming up for you? What's the version of the story? What objections do you have? What exceptions to the rule are apparent? What's being made visible in your watching and listening of this version of the story? How do you comprehend the notion of perfection? Is it a sense of perfection versus imperfection? Like, are there oppositions in there for you? Is it a sense of a particular way of being and looking? Does perfection require something else to occur before it exists? Is it inherent for you? Can it make sense? I don't know. I'm not getting anything at the end of that sentence. Maybe that's a space for you to make up the end of that sentence for yourself. What is the question? What is the end of that sentence that you would like to explore, that you would like to pose, not just to yourself, but others? What feels important on this topic of conversation? It feels very simple for me. I don't understand it as an argument. I don't understand it as a definition that cannot be changed. It doesn't feel strict and fixed. I know how it makes sense to me, and yet I also understand that in the very next moment I will have the experience I'm meant to have, which won't necessarily be philosophical, which won't necessarily define perfection in the same way, which won't necessarily ask me to speak the words about perfection in the same way that I'm speaking about them now. What I'm asked to say here is not necessarily the same thing that I'm asked to say in the very next moment. And I can accept that as I was going to say, as part of the perfection, but it's not necessarily part of the perfection, as the perfection of nowness. The slices of wholeness that are designated now, where everything exists in this now moment in a particular configuration, and then in the next moment there's another slice of now where everything exists in a different configuration. For me, there's no sense that each slice of now is moving towards anything or away from anything, that it's can be judged against, they can be compared against one another. It doesn't feel that way for me, even though the inclusion and allowing exists with people's comparisons. That slice of now includes all of the different stories. That includes the philosophical arguments about what it is. And that's not a contradiction. There's no paradox in there. There's no sense that they're incoherent. In the slice of now that is the oneness experience, it feels natural to include all of those things. They don't necessarily take up a three-dimensional space where they have to sit next to one another and play this game of Tetris. It doesn't feel like a four-dimensional space. It doesn't feel like they can counter one another. Even that sense of physics, things being in reaction, I think we're understanding now an included quantum sense of that story. It's not necessarily replacing classical physics. It's saying that they have always existed together. And that's kind of mind-blowing for physicists who understand what it is they're saying when they say that. Because there's this whole other set of rules that coexist, but they don't take up space next to one another. It's difficult to describe how they interact, because the only language we have to speak about interaction is dimensional. And I think the thing about the relationship between classical physics and quantum physics, or oneness physics, is that all those things are included dimensionally and non-dimensionally. And accepting it is one thing. Being able to see it kind of illustrated as a theory and being able to verbalize it and explain it to someone as a physics. I don't know, it's a beautiful thing, it's a complex thing. And it's a relational thing, because you have to speak the language of the person that you're explaining it to. You have to use their metaphors. It won't translate otherwise. And if it doesn't, that's perfect. I think that's something that's beautiful about surrender. It exists. It's the thing that allows you to seem like you're arguing with something while inherently understanding that what looks like arguing is surrender, is allowing, is oneness, is perfection, is what is. Which again I think is quite difficult for zero-sum philosophers to comprehend. Because there's that expectation that one thing leads to the next, that one thing can be compared to another, that the philosophy is either true or not true. And I guess it's true in one place, and then it's true everywhere. And it's funny because that works back to front in most people's cosmologies, philosophies of how things work. So in oneness, the sense that everything is already on purpose works everywhere, including in places where we're arguing against the purposefulness of something or someone. Whereas in the ask about version of that philosophy, that imposes a purposefulness as a thing that requires evidence, as a thing that requires an outcome that can be judged and ticked off a box of lists of things that categorically identify it as such. That asks about philosophy of perfection and oneness requires certain things to be true before it qualifies. Whereas the already oneness everywhere version of the story accepts even those asked about philosophers and philosophies as part of the perfection, as included, as integral. They don't become a problem. They don't become something outside of itself. And they allow those asked about philosophers and philosophies to exist without contention. So it's like being the one person who accepts everything as sacred. Even if in moments you reject some things as not sacred. Because in those moments that you're rejecting some things as not sacred, you are doing that as oneness, the sacred experience of all that is. And you're not making that true as a concrete thing through time. You're allowing that to be the experience of this moment, and the experience of this moment includes all of those things, the speaking and the feeling and the philosophies. So there's no trick. You're not ever trying to compose yourself and keep yourself within a statement of philosophies. You're not trying to contain your experience and hold yourself to a manifesto. So in the perfection of all that is, whatever you're feeling in this moment is on purpose, is oneness. And you're allowing and including all of those experiences as sacred. Which is not so, the asked about version of that is you're indulging whatever's going on. It's not quite the same. So in the oneness experience, when you're experiencing the nowness of what is, the concepts are fluid. So self is fluid, other is fluid, time is fluid. So what is a feeling and what is a philosophy and what is an identity, and what is the reason and the meaningfulness in this now moment is a fluid now process. So you're not kind of tethered to any web of a story that's judging you and positioning you and asking you to represent a particular version of reality. You are accepting and allowing that every slice of now is a version of all that is in its own configuration, its own rearrangement. And that includes the things called self and feelings and thoughts and wants and desires and philosophies and projects and business and relationships and etc. And so you're never fixed to any one point. There's no string of a story that you're kind of on this linear process that you can point to moments and say, this caused this and this caused that, and the consequence was that, and the outcome is this. You don't have that version of the story, except in the nowness. So in the nowness of this moment, you might have the experience of telling a story that includes an outcome. And in the next moment, you have the next now slice of the oneness experience. And if you're not having that, if you're having a different cosmology, if your reality or experience makes sense in a different version of the story, then what is that story? What is that experience? Do you even need to verbalize it? Who are you explaining it to? What does explaining it do for you? Do you feel compelled to tell that story? Is it important to even understand it as a whole thing, as a wholeness? So I'm just going to leave you with that. And the ultimate question for episode 25, before I press stop broadcast, what does perfection mean to you? How does it play its part in your cosmology? How do you define it? Is it indefinable? Is it a goal? What happens when you get there if it's a goal? How do you know that you've reached it if it's a goal? What are the consequences of reaching that goal? Like, what are the affiliations of perfection and enlightenment for you? What are the perfections? What are the implications of global perfection or universal perfection for you? What would you lose? What would you gain? Who would be in your life? Who wouldn't? How would they function differently? Is that what you're waiting for? And just see what comes up for you, what happens when you allow those ponderances just to be ponderances that don't necessarily have an answer, unless you feel like fishing for one. And if you do, then go fishing. All right, that's it for me. I will see you next Monday month. So it'll be the first Monday of next month, or episode 26. Ciao for now.